Our speaker is Janell Brush, and she works at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She wears a couple of hats. Technically, she's an associate research scientist, but also an avian research scientist and the lead for the research arm of the Shorebird program. Janelle is from Nebraska, and she did her bachelor's degree in biological sciences at the University of Nebraska. And then she came here to Florida, where she did a master's in the Department of Wildlife Ecology. She started working on shorebirds and wetland habitats and has been working on oystercatchers in the Nature Coast region now for about 20 years, and that's what she's going to talk to us about. So thank you so much, Janelle, for being here. Thanks, everyone, for coming to listen, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. Let me get this set up. All right, let me know if that's not.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Like Laura said, I'm going to talk to you about 19 years worth of oystercatcher research that we've done along the Nature Coast. And I want to start by first saying thank you to the many groups of folks that I've had the opportunity to work with and collaborate with and receive support from over the last 19 years where we were working on American oystercatchers in Florida. And I'm going to start from the beginning with a little information about oystercatchers. And so they're a long-lived shorebird, and the bird in the picture, for example, is the first bird that we ever banded in Florida, and this bird turned 17 this year. And they have really strong wintering and also breeding site fidelities. They are state listed as threatened in Florida because they have a really small breeding population, and there's been observed population declines. And because of this, every nest site is important, as are the conservation of roosting sites. They're dependent on coastal areas that support intertidal shellfish beds, and they primarily eat prey items such as oysters, mussels, and crabs. And they often roost and nest adjacent to really quality foraging habitat. So the group of oystercatchers that I'm going to talk to you about today is a subspecies that breeds and winters along the US Atlantic and Gulf coasts. I'm going to start by talking about the group of birds that winters in Florida and what we've learned about this segment of the population. Every 5 years, the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences conducts a range-wide count of American oystercatcher population when birds are flocked up on their wintering grounds. And so in 2023 was the last time they did this count, and they counted over 14,000 total adults and sub-adults on their wintering grounds. And this was a population increase of 43% in the last 15 years. So this is just the range-wide population. This was an incredible population growth that was really due to the coordinated conservation efforts that were happening through the range-wide oystercatcher working group and dedicated resources for improving reproductive outcomes for oystercatchers range-wide. So Florida had 27% of this range-wide population in 2023 when they did this survey. However, the majority of those birds were concentrated in the southern Nature Coast. And this was 21% of the entire range-wide population was counted in these 3 counties. And the way that that breaks out is the majority of these birds were in Levy County, right by Cedar Key. And that currently is the largest concentration of wintering American oystercatchers in their entire range is right there in Cedar Key. So we know that birds are moving from breeding sites in the Northern Atlantic areas down to Florida because we have a lot of work that's being done on research and monitoring of oystercatchers from these states. So we have birds that are banded, unique band identifiers from all these northern states that are being resighted in Cedar Key. So what does this look like when you're out in Cedar Key? So some of you have seen this before. This is a picture of a flock of wintering oystercatchers near Cedar Key. And in this one flock, there were 510 oystercatchers, but there were 50 banded birds that came from 4 different states. So I started working for FWC in 2006. I was the first person that they hired that was tasked with shorebird and seabird research. So I had happily attended my first oystercatcher working group meeting where I met colleagues up and down the Atlantic coast and through the Gulf, and they all took time to corner me at one point or another and ask me how their birds were doing in Cedar Key. Well, I was pretty new to oyster research and conservation, and I had no idea how their birds were doing. And I had no idea how to answer the question, but I knew that the answer to the question might be linked to oysters, and I knew who to go to. So I turned to my colleague and friend, Peter Frederick, who many of you know as the oyster restoration king. Anyhow, what Peter and his colleagues were learning about oysters in the Big Bend was they documented a 66% net decline in the extent of oyster reefs since 1970. Of that, there was an 88% loss of the offshore reefs, but there was no apparent shortage of oyster larvae in the nearshore ecosystem. So the rapid decline of the extent of the oyster reefs in this region could definitely have significant effects on the wintering oystercatcher habitats. But it was within these habitat mosaics that it was unclear what habitat features were used most by oystercatchers for feeding and roosting. So we launched a project to describe the importance and function of foraging and roost habitat for wintering American oystercatchers and to identify factors that might be limiting for this wintering population. So the project results were published in the journal Estuaries and Coasts back in, I just forgot, anyhow, it's published in Estuaries and Coasts, but the bottom line is that birds that winter in Cedar Key are fat and happy. So 95% of the prey items they were selecting were oysters, and I think there were 3% of the prey items that were unknown, likely oysters, and it only was taking 37 minutes of foraging per day for each bird to satisfy their daily energetic needs. So at the time of the study, they were not currently limited by prey availability. However, what we did find was that this group of birds was limited by high tide roosts. So these were offshore reefs that were declining in extent and eroding at accelerated rates. At the time of the project, there were only about 10 offshore reefs that were optimal for high tide roosting. And these were locations where the oystercatchers would go at every single high tide. And they tend to select these areas that were mostly free of vegetation, that offer a 360-degree view of potential predators. And we predicted that if oystercatchers were forced to use suboptimal roosting locations, that there could be survival and energy costs associated with this increased predation, as well as increased anti-predator behaviors. When they're supposed to be resting, instead they're trying to stay alive and they're getting chased by predators. So oystercatchers also face further competition for optimal high tide roost sites as human recreation use of these few exposed reefs at high tide continues to increase. So for the second phase of the project, we selected 2 of these high tide roosts to enhance to benefit wintering oystercatchers. And the design of the roost project was really adopted restoration strategies from Peter Frederick and his team from the early University of Florida pilot projects that were aimed at restoring these intertidal oyster reefs, which incorporated the use of locally available materials, including limestone rock and shell. And the project was completed in 2017. And we knew these restored reefs, they were in rapid decline from erosion and oyster mortality, but we were able to increase the reef area, the elevation, as well as oyster resettlement. So the project areas have withstood several storms since then. And we collaborated with the University of Florida on this project and the Cedar Key Aquaculture Association to involve local aquaculture farmers to obtain and distribute materials to restoration sites. And involving the Cedar Key community with this project really helped to stimulate the local economy and develop project support and support for oystercatcher conservation in the area. So at this point now, we're armed with our oyster research, we're armed with our oystercatcher research, but we are still left with our prediction that there are potential costs to the population when the high tide roosts are unavailable to the birds. So one way to get at that was to look at the annual survival of the wintering population of oystercatchers. And fortunately, we had this amazing tool with these banded birds that were continually revisiting Cedar Key in the winter and getting resighted by partners. So we used 12 years of banded bird resight data from the winter, for the winter group in Cedar Key, from the Oystercatcher Working Group data repository. And with our data set in hand, we needed to think more about our question, what might be affecting the annual survival of these wintering birds? And so over the years, we've documented many things that have prevented the birds from being able to use these roost sites that they want to use, where in theory predation is less. But quantifying something, for example, like disturbance, to incorporate into a quantitative analysis proved to be really challenging. But fortunately, we had this NOAA station near Cedar Key, this tide station. And the most common reason why high tide roosts were not available at high tide was almost always due to water. So we used the higher high data from the nearby tide station, and we called this the maximum daily high tides. And what we did was we looked at 40 years of that maximum high tide data in the winter, so from 1980 to 2018, and we found this break point where the maximum high tides became abnormally higher. Then what we did was we used the 30 years of data prior to that break point to calculate an average annual winter maximum daily high tide. And what we did with that was we called this our normal. And then we used after the years after the break point, we looked at the number of hours the maximum winter high tide was greater than that 1.61 normal. And that's the y-axis in this graph. And we called this the roost inundation risk. And so what we did was we were able to quantify the duration of roosts were likely inundated during those extreme high tide events, which could translate to birds being forced to use these suboptimal roost habitats with that risk of increased threats to survival. So the annual survival estimates from the model range from 0.86 to 0.96, which is very similar to estimates calculated in other oystercatcher populations. However, what we did was we documented a 7.3% decline in survival from 2007 to 2018 and an average annual decline of 0.6%. So we found support for our hypothesis that the frequency of these extreme higher high tide events negatively influenced oystercatcher survival. And this work was recently published in the Journal of Wildlife Management. So the population dynamics of long-lived species like the oystercatcher are really sensitive to changes in adult survival. So we documented this decline in survival throughout the study period, which could negatively affect these range-wide populations if this decline is sustained. So I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk more about the breeding component of this population, moving away from the wintering. So a little bit more information about the biology of these birds is that they tend to initiate breeding at 3 to 5 years old. They primarily nest on the shell rakes and the smaller islands. You don't find them nesting on the big islands. They're not typically nesting on the big, expansive beaches that we have in other parts of the state. They breed from March to August. They're solitary nesting birds. They're very territorial. It takes a really good habitat for them to tolerate each other. And they have semi-precocial chicks. So when the eggs hatch, the chicks are mobile upon hatching, immediately getting into trouble, and completely dependent on their parents for food. And in fact, they're so dependent on the parents for food, even when the chicks can fly, they're still dependent on the parents for food for another 2 months. And so they're very much a management dependent species because it takes 150 days from the time the pair shows up to defend their territory to the time that the chicks no longer need to be fed and they're flying. And that's a long time for a bird to be tied to one location on the beach or in the coastal habitat in Florida. So we can't understate how much of a management dependent species these birds are. But fortunately, we've had a lot of coordinated conservation to really implement these strategies and mechanisms to protect nesting birds in Florida. And these strategies really work and they're sustainable, but it takes a lot of work because that's a long time to be stuck to one area in the coastal habitat in Florida. So we have 419 breeding birds in Florida. It's the third largest concentration of breeding oystercatchers in their range. They're third behind Virginia and North Carolina. And within Florida, our 5 largest concentrations are along the Tullamato River, that's in St. Johns County, the Cross Florida Barge Canal Spoil Islands, just south of Cedar Key in Citrus County, St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, Lanark Reef Critical Wildlife Area, which is in Franklin County, and Cedar Key. So Cedar Key has the 5th largest concentration of breeding oystercatchers in the whole state. And in Cedar Key, there's 12 breeding birds, so typically 6 pairs. And this is data from 2023. And they like Cedar Key because it has all of the habitat that they need. They like to nest on these small islands or shell rakes, higher elevation, optimal view of potential danger. They're near, like foraging habitat is right next door. They've got oysters. They can take the chicks out and they can forage for oysters with them. You often find a nesting site adjacent to oysters. If you don't, there's fewer nests usually in the state. They like sparse vegetation, shelter from inclement weather, also a place for the chicks to hide, to cover from predators. The nesting areas in the area, they look pretty different. They nest in a few areas and they is you can't always predict where they're going to be if you're not used to where they're going to be. Although they like to nest in the same area year after year, they have really strong breeding site fidelity. And the nest sites also look different depending on where they're at along the nature coast. So we've been able to document a lot of threats to nest success over the years that we've been monitoring. However, we were fortunate to be able to bring on a master's student, Nick Vitale, with a collaboration between FWC, Nature Coast Biological Station, and the co-op unit at UF, so that he could dive a little bit deeper into some of the questions that we had about the oystercatcher population that breeds at Cedar Key and at the Barge Canal Spoil Islands. And I'm not going to talk much about the Barge Canal Spoil Islands, but it was one of the main impetus for this project was related to some of the questions that we had about reproductive outcomes at the Spoil Islands. But in Cedar Key, what we'd been documenting for a long time as the biggest threat was nest overwash. And that is exactly what Nick documented in Cedar Key during his master's project, was that 46 of every nest that was laid was overwashed. And these birds will renest as long as they lose their nest when it has eggs. They'll renest a couple of times and try to produce chicks. If the eggs hatch and they lose the chicks, they don't tend to renest. So he confirmed that nest overwash was indeed still an issue in Cedar Key. And at the time, the birds were nesting at 7 different locations. Today, the only nest at 2 sites in Cedar Key. But I have to say, if nests, what he also learned was if nests were not overwashed, then we had really high chick survival. And so if the eggs are able to hatch, the chicks do well. They're fat and happy, just like their winter counterparts. There's plenty of oysters nearby and adjacent to nesting sites. But the challenge is that even though you have high chick survival and you have high reproductive success, it doesn't necessarily translate to increase breeding population size. So I said that the population is listed as threatened in Florida, and that's the breeding population. So a lot of our strategies and initiatives are focused on growing that breeding population of the state threatened species. So the reason why it doesn't directly translate is there's that, first of all, there's that delay where they're not nesting until they're 3 to 5 years old, but we're also losing habitat faster than we can gain it. So we might be at a point where we know there's a lot of birds on the landscape during the nesting season that just don't have a place to nest. So this is Derrick Key. Some of you might remember Derrick Key. We literally watched this island disappear in less than 10 years. And you can see in the picture on the left, you can see the nest in the picture. This was home to the largest concentration of oystercatchers in the Cedar Key area. It had 5 to 6 pairs. And when this island went underwater, we didn't grow any other site in the area by 5 or 6 pairs. We lost those from the breeding population. So Nick was able to quantify this and publish this loss of coastal breeding habitat in the Cedar Key for oystercatchers in estuaries and coasts. And what he found was that total area of nesting birds around Cedar Key declined by 39% between 1974 and 2016. And 85% of this decline was after 1995, which coincided with that reduction in the extent of oyster reefs in the area. And on this graph, this is Derrick Key and this is Gomez Key, right behind it. And this, like I said, this was through 2016. So this might look very different today, and I'll talk about that later. But also this is some of the work that he was able to do, was to look at this change and be able to quantify this. So this is Derrick Key, what it looked like in 1982 and then in 2016. And this is Gomez Keys. So the name of Gomez Keys is Gomez Keys, but right now we're down to just 1 key. But the whole island used to be a series of these islands, and oystercatchers were utilizing a lot of these areas for nesting. So the majority of nesting birds in the Cedar Key area, like I mentioned, they nest on Gomez Key, and productivity is a metric that we use to gauge reproductive success, and it's the number of fledged chicks per pair. So the Oystercatcher Working Group annual range-wide productivity average from the last 5 years was 0.45 chicks per pair. So their goal is 0.5. Once you get, 0.4 is their goal. Once you get to 0.5 chicks per pair, you're seeing range-wide population growth. So during this time that I'm going to show you, the range-wide was 0.45. In Florida, the productivity for the same time period was 0.32 chicks per pair. So that's the entire state. And I'm going to point out that Gomez Key was well above those marks. It's consistently contributing high productivity rates. It's one of the most consistently productive and largest concentration of breeding oyster catchers. It's not a very big island when you get 5 pairs that are tolerating each other, which is unusual for such a small area. And sites like Gomez Key that are consistently productive are relatively rare range wide, but they're critical for contributing to not only the breeding population in Florida, but the population range wide. And here's just a quick example of a bird that we have that's banded on Gomez Key that kind of highlights breeding site fidelity. So it's banded red 64. It was banded as a chick on Gomez Key in 2015. It initiated breeding back on Gomez Key. It was only 2 years old. They tend to not breed until they're three. And it managed to produce 8 fledglings in the next 7 years, which is pretty incredible productivity for this one bird who we know because it's banded and it's always on Gomez Key. So we have this, I'm going to talk just a little bit about restoration and enhancement, but restoration to enhance these offshore sites and breeding areas might mitigate some of these population level impacts of sea level rise. And oysters are key to mitigating habitat loss in this area, as many folks know. And every restoration strategy that we have to actually benefit oyster catchers really must include an oyster component to be successful and also to be sustainable, as these oysters help buffer these areas that the oyster catchers are using. And in the example of restoration to maintain breeding habitats, there are 2 main restoration objectives that we focus on. One's to improve that nesting habitat, but also to improve food resources for oyster catchers. So successful restoration and habitat enhancement projects really incorporate these nature-based restoration strategies that help expand and elevate potential oyster catcher nesting habitat to prevent further erosion. They promote oyster recolonization and they support the entire ecological community. So everything that I have presented so far has been all the work that we've done prior to the series of awful storms that we've had in the last year and a half. And all the storms that we had passed within 60 miles of Cedar Key. And I know everyone on this call knows that, and they likely experienced it firsthand. But what this means is that our critical roosting and nesting sites in the area have degraded to further than what I've described today. And we're in a situation where we need to find creative solutions to mitigate habitat loss in the area and continue to explore opportunities to restore and enhance the habitats that the oyster catchers depend on. And the tricky part is that birds won't just move. You lose habitat, they're not just going to be able to move because there isn't other habitat available, and they're really hardwired to return to the same winter roost and breeding sites that they've gone to every year. That site fidelity piece is really important. So we try to focus on where they want to be, where they are. Can we enhance or restore these areas? For example, when Derrick Key went underwater, we had 5 pairs of oyster catchers that literally tried to nest and were getting overwashed every single tidal cycle. They would not leave until that island was completely underwater for a whole entire tidal cycle, and then they left. So the other piece of the puzzle is that we're really working harder to continue to share information about how important the Nature Coast is for oyster catchers and really gain that stakeholder support for oyster conservation and habitat restoration along the Nature Coast that will benefit oyster catchers. We realize that it's such an important area and so many people don't realize it. And we really need to generate that stakeholder support if we're going to continue to do work in the Nature Coast to help benefit the oyster catchers. And that is all I have for you today.
Thank you so much. This is awesome. This webinar series is usually dominated by plant folks, so it's great to have some talks from some vertebrates. So folks, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand or turn your camera on and ask those questions directly. I'll start out. We talked about oyster catchers and about this incredible habitat in Cedar Key. Do oyster catchers co-nest or use those reefs with other birds, or So if you restore those areas, are we just going after oyster catchers and oysters, or other birds as well?
So they do sometimes they'll nest. They're not territorial with seabirds, for example. These terns or Wilson's plovers are another species that nest in the area. They'll share the same habitat with those other species. We don't have a lot of those other species nesting, especially around Cedar Key. So we had Corrigan's, the further out Corrigan's area had accreted for a while. And we had one pair of oyster catchers, a least tern colony, and I think a Wilson's plover pair. And they were all in that one little, I think it's underwater now, but a little bit further out in Oregon. So they do nest with their other shorebirds and seabirds, but they don't really like to be close to each other. They're very territorial, but we did find, I don't know if that graph that I had about Gomez, that we went from 4 pairs to 5 pairs in 1 year, they actually let another pair in to nest. Toward the end of the nesting season, there was a pair that was looking for a spot clearly, and they let them in, which we had never documented anywhere. That they're nesting that close together, and they let another pair in, especially at the end of the nesting season when a lot of them had chicks. So they want to be where the good resources are.
Yeah. And do you think they're less territorial in those really good habitats because they don't need to be? Yeah.
Yep. Or
Cool.
maybe it's worth it.
Yeah, yeah. We do have a question in the chat. I'm curious about oyster catcher populations in the Tampa Bay area. I'm with Pinellas County Environmental Management, and we have implemented a lot of living shoreline oyster restoration projects, including the installation of an oyster reef.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So historically, the largest concentration of oyster catchers nesting in Florida was 3D in Tampa Bay. It's Spoil Island 3D, and then 2D was right behind it. And over time, we lost a lot of pairs in that area. And I'm not the expert in that area. We haven't done a lot of research, but I know they were trying to mitigate habitat loss in that area. I also know that the oysters, the birds were having to go further to get oysters over time. The oysters that were right around the area weren't. It was my understanding from the folks that worked on them that they were having the adults were having to go further. So I think fewer adults started nesting there. They're also really, really sensitive to things on the shoreline. Mm-hmm. So they want to be able, even though, like for example, at Derrick Key, they were nesting kind of around the mangroves and kind of under the mangroves. They don't do that very often. They don't want to be near the trees. They don't want things they can't see around on the beach. And so, their roosting sites are clear of all of that. There might be a little bit of non-woody vegetation, but they're really sensitive to structures on the shoreline. So you have to be really, and there's been a lot of lessons learned collectively in Florida about restoration strategies that were on the shore the oyster catchers were leaving. They didn't want to nest there anymore because they couldn't see. So we've collectively, programmatically, we've been learning a lot about how we need to be thoughtful with restoration to benefit oyster catchers. Might be slightly different than what we might do in other contexts, but we have to find that middle ground where, okay, this will work here, but it won't work here. And I don't know, like I said, I think there's Alafia Banks is another, for the person that asked the question, is another site in Tampa Bay that's growing in numbers. And I know they've spent a lot of time and energy to help augment some of the other habitats in that area so the oyster catchers have a place to nest.
Do you have a favorite bird that you look for every year?
I do. Silly question, right? Silly answer. So the very first slide that I put on R5 was the very first bird that was ever banded in Florida. And I banded that bird along the Amelia River as a chick. And now it breeds on the Telemato River in the same exact spot year after year. And she's pretty incredible. So R5 is my favorite. She's the oldest and the first one that we banded. Good question.
Go ahead, Savannah.
Yeah, so oh my gosh, those trail camera pictures of the overwash and those eggs in the saltwater are just so heartbreaking with the bird watching them. Oh my gosh, I almost cried. Anyway, so when that happens, do the eggs immediately die from saltwater exposure, or there's no chance that they will recover from that?
What's funny is it was actually Nick's project that with those great pictures of overwash. I had a tendency to say, like, I don't want you to put a camera at Cedar Key because I don't want to lose it, to just throw it into the Gulf because it's going to get overwashed. But Nick was adamant, we got to figure out what's going on. What are the other threats besides overwash in Cedar Key? So he put cameras out there. It was the first time we realized, we always thought that the eggs got washed away or just saltwater inundated. They get buried. So when the overwash happens, the sediment fills up around them. If you dig, you can get to them. But at that point, they're already, like, you'll see the birds trying to dig them out. And we realized, they're getting buried. We never, for some reason, we just didn't think that was what was happening. So they're no longer viable once that happens and they get buried. And the birds can't dig them out. And then we started to like, can we dig them out? But it's too late by then.
Awful.
Anybody else have questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for that talk, and your beautiful pictures. That was great. Our final webinar series for this session will be May 21st, and that will be Chris Anastasio from Southwest Florida Water Management District talking about seagrass mapping. So I hope to see a bunch of you guys back, and thanks again, Janelle. Bye.
Thank you.